It's January 2026, and Alaska natives face a double catastrophe. One skipper left. Nick Katelnikoff, 76 years old, is the last commercial fisherman operating out of Ouzinkie's harbor. The village once had 17 salmon seine permits. Now it has 3, with only 1 boat still fishing. Bristol Bay villages have lost over 75% of their original permits since 1975. And on the Yukon River, a 7-year ban on king salmon fishing, running through 2031, has shuttered what little was left of native commercial operations. More than 50% of Alaska native-held salmon permits have drained away since the limited entry system began. How did Alaska natives lose the right to fish waters their ancestors harvested for thousands of years? Why are permits still leaving rural communities at accelerating rates? And why won't lawmakers in Juneau do anything about it in 2026? In January 2026, rural Alaska native fishing communities face what advocates call an economic catastrophe. Permit ownership has declined by 32% on average for native communities since 1975, but the losses accelerate every year. Some Bristol Bay villages have lost over 75% of their original permit holdings. Koniag villages were originally issued 97 salmon permits in 1975. By 2019, they held just 36, a devastating 63% loss. By 2026, even fewer remain. The halibut fishery collapse hits even harder. In 1995, 707 fishermen living in native communities owned halibut quota. By 2021, that number plummeted to 235, a 69% decrease. Bristol Bay residents received 712 drift gillnet permits in 1975. By 2021, they held just 308. They received 660 beach-based setnet permits in 1975. By 2021, only 313 remained. According to state data, the losses accelerated in recent years, even with support programs in place. The economic pressure is mounting. Permits for some salmon fisheries can cost over $100,000 to $250,000. A modern vessel, combined with a seine permit and gear, costs roughly $500,000. For rural residents with no credit history and no collateral, it's impossible. Some 80% of indigenous people surveyed agreed that villages are in crisis because of loss of access to fisheries. Only 12–13% of families now have any current engagement in commercial fishing, despite most having multi-generational ties to the industry. Then came April 2024. Canada and Alaska signed a 7-year moratorium on Yukon River Chinook salmon fishing. The ban runs through 2031, covering 1 full life cycle of king salmon. The moratorium halted commercial, sport, recreational, and personal fishing for king salmon on the mainstem Yukon and Canadian tributaries. The goal is to rebuild the population to 71,000 Canadian-origin Chinook salmon crossing the border. Last year's passage estimate was under 15,000 fish. But Alaska native communities weren't consulted before the agreement was signed. Karma Ulvi, chief of the native village of Eagle at the Alaska-Yukon border, says she was disappointed the state did not engage in consultation with Alaskan tribes. Decisions are not made in our favor, Ulvi said. Rhonda Pitka, chief of the village of Beaver, located approximately 175 kilometers north of Fairbanks, described the shock. It was kind of just thrown at us. It was a big shock to me. Villages in Ulvi's district placed their own moratorium on Chinook salmon over a decade ago, trying to protect the species. Despite their efforts, the population continued collapsing. Now, 2 years into the 7-year ban, Alaska natives along the Yukon haven't been able to harvest king salmon since 2019. In 2026, salmon must be flown in from Bristol Bay, over 1,000 miles away. Bertha Ulvi, the chief's mother, remembers when her family's fish camp could easily catch 300 salmon in a day. Those days are gone. Nick Katelnikoff learned to fish from his father and got his first paycheck as a fisherman when he turned 8 years old. Now 76, he steers his boat, the MZL, through the treacherous waters off Kodiak Island's Spruce Cape. He's the kind of guy who friends say can call his catch into the boat. But in 2026, Katelnikoff is the last skipper running a commercial fishing boat from Ouzinkie's harbor. The village once thrived on fishing. 17 salmon seine permits operated out of Ouzinkie in the 1970s. Today, 3 permits remain and only Katelnikoff's boat still works. The harbor sits largely empty, dilapidated boats ground on shore. An anonymous respondent in a recent survey wrote, "We used to be people who fished. Now we don't have access to our resources located in our backyard." Katelnikoff's story mirrors dozens of native villages in 2026. Places that once called themselves fishing towns have been hollowed out. The people who live in these Gulf communities, disconnected from the road system and reachable only by plane or boat, are overwhelmingly Alaska native. They face high prices for groceries, fuel, and supplies flown or barged in from afar. Jobs outside of fishing are scarce. Fishing jobs are increasingly sparse too. The catastrophe traces back to one decision. In 1972, Alaska voters approved a new system that placed caps on the number of permits available in each fishery. The policy, known as limited entry, was put into effect in 1975. At the time, new fishermen flooded the industry as salmon harvests plummeted from historic highs. Alaska's government responded with a monumental change. No longer could just any commercial fisherman set out in a boat and cast their net, even Alaska natives whose ancestors had fished for generations. The limited entry system created permits that have since been valued collectively at more than $1 billion. The policy transformed fishing rights into financial assets to be bought and sold freely. When permits first rolled out, nearly half went to Alaska Native people, who represented about 18% of the state's population at the time. The system prioritized permits for fishermen most financially dependent on the industry for their livelihoods. Initially, it seemed fair, but the unintended consequences proved catastrophic. Terry Gardner, who promoted the limited entry bill in the 1970s, admitted that nobody was really a big fan of the transferable permits. But it was what would work, what would be constitutional, he said. The eye-popping permit values created a powerful incentive for rural fishermen to cash out. Those who sold at the top of the market likely came out ahead financially, but the one-time windfalls severed an indigenous tradition of commerce tied to Alaska's ocean harvests. The high prices put permits out of reach for many rural Alaskans who lacked credit history or collateral for loans. At 76 years old, George Lady watched for decades as members of his local tribe sold off their boats and permits, making them largely bystanders as others harvest salmon once claimed as tribal property. Today, Lady is one of the few native fishermen left in his area. The Tlingit elder wants to pass his decades of maritime expertise to a new generation. Lady serves as president of the Douglas Indian Association. Under his leadership, the tribe acquired waterfront property in Juneau for a communally owned fish processing plant. In 2022, the tribe spent $210,000 on a 42-foot gillneter, which will double as a marine debris cleanup vessel. The boat, FV Ocean Gold, sits docked in Juneau Harbor. The tribe then approached the state agency that oversees commercial fisheries with a simple question. Could the tribe buy a permit to harvest salmon? The answer came swift and harsh. The limited entry law only allows ownership by individuals, not by collectives such as companies or tribes. Lawmakers who designed the system in the 1970s wanted to prevent corporate takeovers, but the rule now blocks tribes from securing fishing access for their communities. This is ours. It always has been ours, and because we joined the United States of America, somehow we have lost control of everything that has belonged to us. If we've got to buy back our heritage, then so be it, Lady said. He asked lawmakers a pointed question: what's the holdup? In 2026, he's still waiting for an answer. Bristol Bay tells the same story with bigger numbers in 2026. Alaskans hold only 44% of the 1,862 drift gillnet fleet permits and 64% of the 964 permits to fish from beaches with set nets. Washington residents have the second biggest stake, with 34% of drift gillnet fleet permits and 14% of beach-based harvests. The money follows the permits out of Alaska. In 2020, Alaskans claimed $118.78 million of the money paid to fishermen, while out-of-state permit holders earned $165.65 million. In 2021, the average selling price for a Bristol Bay permit reached $195,400. The huge harvests of recent years drove permit values sky-high, creating even stronger incentives for rural residents to sell. Robin Samuelson, 72, chairs the Bristol Bay Economic Development Corp. The organization uses earnings from congressional harvest allocations to help residents secure salmon permits. In 2020, the corporation helped 23 people acquire permits, but it hasn't stopped the bleeding. According to state data, permits continue leaving the region at accelerating rates even with this support. We don't have enough candidates from our communities stepping forward. A lot of them say, we don't have the capital or the money to get involved, said Samuelson, who served as the nonprofit's board chair for 3 decades. The system needs to be changed, he warned in 2025, or rural Alaska communities are not going to survive. One by one, they're going to disappear. Advocates hoped for a hearing on the subject during the 2025 legislative session. One never materialized. Lawmakers proposed no bills to address the problem. We're operating under a law that's been in place for 52 years, and it's broke, it's not meeting the demands of today, Samuelson said in May 2025. In early 2025, Northern Journal sent a survey on limited entry and rural fisheries access to 16 state senators and representatives whose districts border the Gulf of Alaska. None completed it. Approached by reporters at the Capitol, several lawmakers declined to discuss the issues. Some pleaded ignorance. We're going to work on it and we'll try to do all we can, Senate President Gary Stevens said. But I don't see any reason I need to meet with you on this. Stevens has represented Kodiak Island for more than 2 decades. Kodiak Island, whose indigenous villages were once home to proud commercial fishing fleets and a multi-generational heritage of fish-related trade. Now, in 2026, he still won't meet to discuss their crisis. Max Werhatch, executive director of the United Southeast Alaska Gillneters Association, rejected the idea that lawmakers should change the permit system. Native corporations and a regional fisheries nonprofit in Bristol Bay have plenty of capital, Werhatch said in an email, and both can easily afford to support rural residents seeking state loans. But the data proves this approach has failed. Permits keep leaving at accelerating rates. Representative Jonathan Katelnikoff said he and his aides put thousands of hours into developing legislation allowing local trusts to buy and own permits, then lease them to new fishermen. The bill never reached the House floor for a vote. Katelnikoff believes the proposal bewildered legislators from urban communities unfamiliar with the limited entry system. Industry stakeholders representing existing permit holders opposed it fiercely. A broader coalition has formed, including indigenous-owned regional corporations for Southeast Alaska, Bristol Bay, and Koniag, along with the Nature Conservancy. They're readying an organized push for legislative reform in 2026, but those groups haven't decided on specific legislative changes to push. The lack of clarity makes passage unlikely. Louise Stutz, who chairs the House Fisheries Committee, said any legislative proposals would have to accommodate different constituencies. I certainly support reducing barriers to accessing fisheries for Alaskans and keeping permits in rural communities, she said in a statement. However, I also believe that any potential change to limited entry needs to be the result of a stakeholder-driven process. Translation: nothing will happen in 2026. It's January 2026. 63% of Koniag permits gone. 69% of halibut quota holders disappeared. 32% average decline across all native communities. Over 75% loss in some Bristol Bay villages. One skipper left in Ouzinkie. A 7-year Yukon River king salmon ban running through 2031. More than 50% of Alaska native-held salmon permits drained away. Zero legislative action in the 2025 session. Zero progress on community trust proposals. 1973 law designed to save Alaska's fisheries ended up gutting native fishing fleets. Permits meant to protect sustainability became financial instruments traded like stocks. Communities with thousands of years of fishing knowledge were priced out within one generation. Urban operators with capital bought up the rights. Young rural Alaskans can't compete with $100,000 to $250,000 price tags. George Lady, Nick Katelnikoff, Robin Samuelson, Karma Ulvi, they're fighting for their heritage in 2026. Lawmakers in Juneau remain largely silent. The permits keep draining away at accelerating rates, and Alaska Native communities watch their way of life disappear, one sold permit at a time while the state does nothing.